Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Whitman. I am the thesis advisor for Raj, who will be speaking in just a moment. The thesis committee also has Francie Peterson and Celeste Esenberry in and who have joined us now. And I am happy to be seeing so many familiar names. Hi, Hazel and Aaron and David and everybody else. And also, I am happy to be seeing so many of Raj's friends from, I'll just say, around the world and family and so on and so forth. Today's master's thesis defense is the end of a long road for Raj, who has been in the United States for a while to be part of the Master of Science in Teaching program at the University of Maine. He arrived here in about 2019. Was it 2019? Okay, don't really remember. It's been COVID fog, that kind of thing. The original plan of his work when he came here from Bihar in India was to, we spoke about doing some professional development with teachers in India. And we spoke about this through November of 2019, December of 2019. Things started seeming a bit weird in January, and I was a little hesitant to buy some plane tickets. And by February of 2020, we had decided that we were not going to India and COVID was a problem. And since then, at that point, we quickly pivoted in what his thinking was, and he decided that he wished to learn more about the American teaching system by studying the response of teachers to COVID, which is what he'll be talking about as his master's thesis work. I'll let him talk about that. But just one more thing, as he finishes up here at the University of Maine, he'll be taking on a position teaching in Boston, down a little bit south of us. And in Boston, he had multiple offers, which is actually really awesome to hear that he had multiple teaching offers. And the one that he chose, he picked because it was the biggest challenge. And I think that that says a lot about the kind of person that he is and what he is seeking in his work. So if you could start your presentation, Raj, so that I can, transition over to you. And thank you for hiding me. So the work that he will be describing is, is investigating the teaching and assessment experiences of Maine secondary science teachers during the COVID lockdown. And with that, I will turn over the floor to you, Raj.
I think I need to unmute myself. Okay. I think I'm audible to everybody. Okay. So this work is dedicated to everybody we lost during the COVID time, because this research came out of that pandemic. And I'll go ahead and start and show you my overview for the presentation. And first of all, I would like to thank everybody who's here and has taken out time on a weekday at 9 a.m. to be here with me and support me. And I really hope, and I'm very excited about actually sharing what I've been living in for the last 2 years with my committee. So this is the overview of the presentation. We'll go through 6 different blocks, starting with introduction. So let's get started. So as an introduction, the reason we wanted to investigate this phenomenon exactly was because as a scientist, when you're trying to study a system, for example, education system, there are multiple parameters to it. Like, for example, there is national and state standards, curriculum, what mission the school has, grading system and expectations. And then there are parameters like assessment and student identity, engagement, and agency. And this list can go on and on. And what happened, usually researchers study one of these parameters at a time in a controlled classroom environment. But what happened in the COVID was all of this was questioned at once, because nothing was familiar anymore. All of a sudden, we moved to remote learning in March 2020. And so all of these parameters were questioned all at once. And that motivated us to study the system, because this was a really good system to study where everything was pretty much in the air at that time. And that led us to, of all the list of the things that I showed in the previous slide, my focus was more on the 5 factors that I wanted to study. First being, what was the impact on students according to teachers when this happened? And how did they deal with the issue of equity with their students? And that led to my first research question. And then I wanted to study how did their priorities and expectations shift when they moved to remote instruction. And that led to my second research question. And then I also wanted to investigate how did assessment and teaching practices change, which is basically the heart of this thesis. And I also was interested in what was the other factors outside of classroom, for example, parents and administration, that affected their decision-making during this time. And what did they learn from this, and what is their vision for the future? So that led to my 5 research questions. But that's a brief introduction. And now moving on to literature review. So what kind of body of knowledge actually informs the sense making that I'm trying to do with the data that I collected? So the first framework I'll be using is something called hierarchy of needs. It's a very classic concept in psychology, which basically defines that humans have a hierarchy of needs from very basic to like higher needs as we move on. And this concept is also adopted in education. And an interesting paper came out in 2012, which basically tried to show a parallel between Maslow's hierarchy of needs with the needs of students in an online classroom. So for example, the very fundamental need, according to Maslow, is the physiological need of food, water, and air for us. And the same way in a classroom, it would be like study material, access to technology, and free lunch if the school offers that. Then talking about safety being the second need that we have as a hierarchy, which comes through routine and structure and consistency in the classroom. Then the need for relationship that comes through a classroom community. And then the need for respect in the classroom from peers. And the highest goal being self-actualization, which could be seen as for students becoming intrinsic learners, that they're motivated to learn by themselves, being the highest goal of education, perhaps, as a parallel. The second framework that I'll be using is teachers' expectations. So 60 years ago, somebody showed in a very classic paper, which was very popular, that the teachers have expectations about their students in a classroom, and that can actually either improve or limit the outcomes of students. And like people study this further down, and they realize that there is more to this than just 2 steps in there, that when teachers develop expectations, they treat their students differently. And that leads to how students react to those treatments from teachers. And then that finally leads to either their student outcomes being improved or limited, basically. This model is adopted from Johnson paper, which was published in 2019 as well. So this is our second framework, and this will be very helpful while we talk about the findings that I had from my data. The third framework will be about assessment. I'm going to define assessment into, divide assessment into 2 parts, formative and summative. Summative assessment is basically anything that is graded in a classroom, quiz, test, anything that is usually at the end, and you're trying to assess how much learning has happened, basically. Whereas formative assessment is more about informing the teaching process, giving a student feedback without trying to put a grade on it. For example, using clickers in the classroom, or like just reading the body language of students when you walk around the classroom. That kind of assessment is formative because you're trying to assess for teaching in some way. So this is inspired from NRC's framework in 2001. And then the further division of formative assessment is into 2 parts, formal and informal. Formal being something which you're giving out to everybody in a large group, for example, clicker questions, again. And informal will be something like with small groups or one-to-one when you're interacting with your students and you gather casual data while you're in the classroom or at other platforms. So this division will be helpful for us when we talk about our data. The next thing, which is very important for Maine, is as we have adopted next generation science standards, is just to recall that we try to teach in a 3-dimensional way in Maine classrooms. We try to hit the content, but at the same time, we're also trying to make sure our students are learning science and engineering practices and focusing on skill set that they're developing while trying to read those content, and also the cross-cutting concepts, which are the things that are across different disciplines of science, which are relevant. So just to have a recollection here. So these are the 3 frameworks that we'll be using when we try to make sense of the data. But there is a lot of the research and study that has also informed what we found in the data, which I'll come back to in the discussion chapter. Okay, so methods. How did we do this? Like, how did this entire study take place and how it was conducted from the scratch? The first thing was it is a qualitative research. So you're not going to see any statistics analysis or like any scary chart or data. We are more interested in understanding the human experience and what the essence of it was. So the framework that I'm using, the research approach that I'm using is phenomenology. And it took me 2 years to pronounce that word, but I can finally do it now. And what phenomenology is basically is like you're talking about the essence of the lived experience of the teachers here. And we are interested more into what was experienced by teachers during this time of COVID teaching and how it was experienced. And a part of this research is also informed by cross-case analysis method. where we will be comparing different clusters of schools and see how their experiences in different kind of schools was different for teachers. And that should inform the issue of teaching and assessment in a more enriched and a wide way, basically. And a part of it is also inspired by pseudo-grounded theory, which is basically like grounded theory in the sense that it lets the codes to be more open, but it's not as grounded theory oriented because we're already biased towards what we were looking for when we were asking our questions from teachers. So the setting of the research was we had 10 Maine science teachers. 8 of them were from high school and 2 of them from middle school. The recruitment process was snowball sampling. So we basically had volunteers as teachers, and they gave, like, we requested them at the end of the interview if they could refer us to somebody else who could also volunteer for this study. So they were not paid for this participation. And the structure of the interview was semi-structured, and it was like more into conversation. The reason was because the questions were a little open-ended. So we really wanted to capture the essence of what they wanted to share rather than like directing them to something very more particular. And how we recruited our teachers was a little biased too. We wanted to have a representation from different kind of schools as well. So we were very lucky in that we got 3 teachers from affluent schools. And I have given them pseudonames here as Amy, Adam, and Elisa for the A. Then we had 3 teachers from middle level schools, which were like schools with student population that is almost 25 to 50% on free and reduced lunch. And then we have high need schools, which are more rural and lack resources usually, where students population is more than 50% of student population is free and reduced lunch. So this is the 3 division. And anytime you see a name appearing at the same alphabet, the category is pretty visible then that way. This is a flow chart for my research. So the interest was basically how did teaching and assessment happen during COVID? We did 10 Zoom interviews with these 10 teachers. We asked them 13 questions. We coded those questions, and the analysis process led us to 5 major themes that we are about to see. And then there were also some 7 minor themes. And these themes were informed by the different frameworks that I just talked about in the previous slide. So how did I code exactly? How did this analysis process look like? Well, the first thing we did was we uploaded the Zoom interviews on a software called Otter AI, and we transcribed everything from video to text. And then I used a software called Atlas TI to code my text to see the general patterns for the first time. And then I went back to old school and used manual coding and analysis and using the process of highlighting. And this is how a typical page of more than 200 pages that I had from transcription looked like, where I was highlighting important statements and giving them codes. And for example, this is one statement that I used as a code. So one of the teachers, when they were asked what were the priorities as they moved to remote instruction, this is what they replied. And they said, our priorities were contact, keeping in contact with the students. In fact, we spend a lot more time, I spend more time emailing, calling parents, just checking on kids to make sure that everything was getting what they needed. I spend more time doing that than I did, looking at the schoolwork. And this is from Hank, who was a high need school teacher. So this was, for example, this quotation was quoted for contact, and the word explicitly appears there. But sometimes this was also quoted for being available, because that's what the essence of the teacher is trying to say. And the word available doesn't explicitly appear here. And these 2 codes kept appearing consistently for many teachers. So we merged them together as one code for contact and being available. And then these codes were put in a spreadsheet, and whichever teacher it was true for was given a tick mark. And then we were looking for general patterns and what we found. Do not try to read anything here. It's just show the overall pattern of how it looked like for coding process. So that was my analysis process. We had 13 interview questions, like I said. We asked them about priorities and their expectations first. Then we talked about their assessment and teaching practices. And then we talked about how their students were impacted and how did they try to be fair and equitable with that. And then some challenges that they had, what strategies that they used, what is the thing that they learned, and what were some positives. And when they were answering these questions, I started to realize that when they're answering question 2, they're actually answering question 1. And sometimes when they're answering question 4, they're actually answering question 5. So this led to a very beautiful clustering of these questions together. So what I realized was question 1 and 2 is actually kind of similar. Question 3 to 6 is similar. Question 7 and 8 is similar. And so and then putting them as themes was the next idea that came up. So what I did basically was I put question 7 and 8 as one theme together, which is called impact on students and equity issue. Then the next set of 2 questions were here that got themed together. Then we had these 4 questions, which was more about teaching and assessment and had intermixed answers got clustered together. Then the factors outside the classroom was a standalone question. and then the 3 questions at the end got clustered together. And the reason I named questions 7 and 8 as theme 1 and not like question 1 and 2 is because it makes sequentially more sense to talk about student impact and equity issue first, and then talk about priorities and expectations of teachers and how that led into teaching assessment practices and factors outside the classroom that influence all of this. So this made sequentially more sense, so that's why I themed them according to the sense-making process. So that was how I coded everything and how the study was conducted. Let's see what we found out from here. So moving on to findings. The first thing that was found was impact on students and equity issue. So just talking about impact on students, we asked our teachers, how were your students impacted due to this following, due to the move to the remote instruction during COVID times, in terms of emotional stability, technology access, study environment, family issue, lack of routine boredom, and all other extra parameters. And they answered our questions. And what we saw was 4 of the answers were very common among most teachers, whereas some of the other answers were more unique to affluent school teachers. And then some answers were more unique to high need school teachers. And do not again try to read anything. I have some research here for you because I love your eyes. So in general, what we saw was students did not receive differentiated instruction. We also saw that students struggled with lack of routine and structure for everybody. They were struggling emotionally, they were bored, and they struggled for quiet space as well. So this is something which was common for most of the teachers. And here's an example from Henry for that. But there was still a lot of contrast among how affluent teachers and high needs school teachers described their students' experience. So for example, affluent teachers talked about students who are not as motivated, students missed the social aspect of school, they did not receive, but they did receive the support from parents and guiding counselor in these schools. And here's an example from Adam, who is an affluent school teacher that talked about this, and then compared this to high need school teachers, which described that the need for emotional health was very high among students there in those schools. Some students didn't even have internet, and most of the students were living in very poor study environments. And here's a quote from Hope, who is a high need school teacher, and I would like to read this. So emotionally, the first month, I literally was talking to either students or parents from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., either via emails or phone calls. The emotional need of their families were so high. The anxiety was all over the place. So even though students were impacted in every school in Maine, there was a contrast between how these students in affluent schools were impacted compared to students in high need schools were impacted. And there was, in terms of impact, there were also some minor themes that we saw. For example, we saw that in general, when teachers were describing the students' experiences in high need schools, they described that the need for emotional support is higher in these schools. Again, going back to the triangle that we just saw, like the basic needs of the hierarchy is more high in these schools. We also saw that unexpectedly, some of the learners who don't do very good in normal classrooms, all of a sudden started doing really well when we went remote. And here is a quote from Mike for that, and I'll go ahead and read this. I had one student that had a hard time at school, and when we went to this remote, she blossomed. And there are stories of within that where there is a population of students that did so well that normally do horribly in the classroom. So this was a very unexpected finding. And this was also more particular for non-affluent schools, so high need schools and middle level schools who talked about this. And then there is a finding about how like special needs students were actually needing way more extra support than they usually do in a regular classroom. And here's a quote from Myra for that. So moving on, so the next question we ask our teachers, given the variation on the impact on your students, how did you still try to be fair and equitable? So this was the question that we asked them. And the answer that we got was pretty much all of them said yes and no, and they tried their best. So they did feel like they were trying to be fair and equitable in some way, but they also felt that they were restricted because of some reason or the other. So for example, out of the 10 teachers, one of them only said yes, they were able to be fair and equitable, and one of them said no, whereas 8 of them were more in the middle of saying yes and no both at the same time. And here is an example from Henry, who is a high need school teacher, who was described that it was not difficult for the students to reach the level of passing, and that was his way to be fair and equitable. But he was also limited by that students were living in an environment that didn't have the resources they needed or had many distractions. And that's the reason it made him feel like he wasn't able to be fair and equitable. And so when we coded for the reasons that teachers described, there was again a contrast. So why they thought that they were able to be fair and equitable was different for high need school versus affluent schools. And why they thought they were not able to be fair and equitable was also different for these two schools. But being available was one common code about how they thought that they were able to be fair and equitable. Whereas affluent schools kind of reduced their expectations a little bit and gave students more leniency. High need schools had to reduce their expectation way a lot more compared to that. And we'll just talk about that in a minute in the next slide. So talking about priorities and expectations now, how did these two things change for these set of 10 teachers? This was my first question actually in the interview. So how did your priorities change after you moved to the remote instruction? And teachers in general said that their priority was more about contact and being available for their students and focusing on health and safety of students and keeping students engaged. And here's a quote from Alicia for that. But again, there was a contrast in terms of priority among the high need school teachers and affluent school teachers. For example, affluent school teachers were more focused towards the social and emotional well-being of students. And here is a quote from Amy who described that. Whereas high need school teachers were more focused towards the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy, food security and high emotional needs, for example. And here's a quote from Hope for that, which I'll read. Our biggest priorities were their safety and their basic needs. Before we could do anything else, it was to make sure that the students were fed and that they were all in a safe place. So again, the very basic priorities of these teachers were very different as they went into teaching and assessment. In terms of teachers' expectations, what was common among all teachers was they all said that they reduced their expectations because it was no ordinary time. Everybody was teaching remotely for the first time. So they had to reduce expectations to be able to cope up with the challenges. But again, there was a contrast. High need school teachers said that they reduced their expectations for all students. And whereas affluent school teachers mentioned that for AP and honors classes, which are more advanced level classes in American school, their expectations were still pretty much the same, whereas they reduced their expectation only for their lower level classes. So again, there was a contrast among these two cluster of schools. Now talking about, so we know that students were impacted differently. We know the priorities and expectations of teachers were different in these schools as well. So how did the assessment and teaching look like, given all this background that we have built up so far? Well, before we go into assessment and teaching, let's talk a little bit about grading system. The first thing that happened when we went to remote instruction in March 2020 was that the grading system for most schools changed. And here's a summary of all the 10 teachers that we have in this study. So the affluent school teacher, Amy and Adam, their grading system was the only one that remained the same. They were still giving alphanumeric grades to their students. There was Mike, who was still doing numerical grades, but at the end, his school went into some kind of pass and fail remediation structure as well. And then there were 4 schools here who were doing pass-fail structure. So the student at the end gets either a pass or a fail or incomplete or something like that. And then there was 3 schools who were doing do no harm policy, which were all 3 high need schools. And do no harm policy is basically you cannot lower down the grade of a student after moving to remote instruction. So for example, if I had an A in March, even if I do no work till June, I still get an A at the end of the year. Whereas if I was failing before March, I could still do work during the lockdown and improve my grade and get an A. So this was a kind of grading system which basically made it very challenging for teachers because there were a lot of students who were already passing and they then didn't really do as much work because they could still get a good grade and get away with it. So in terms of like how teachers felt about these grading systems, I would say the most satisfied teacher was Mike. And like he described in this code, and he felt that having this numerical grade at the same time, also accommodating the students who needed the pass-fail in the system was a very good idea for the school, and it really worked out well for him. Whereas other teachers did emotionally struggle with, like, for example, Amy and Adam struggled with cheating issues, whereas these teachers struggled with more absenteeism because students were not turning up in the classroom or for the work. So now let's talk about assessment. Given all the background that we have built up so far, how did assessment practices look like for teachers? Grading system had changed for most of them, so assessment got really streamlined, and teachers were more focused towards content rather than science and engineering practices. And one common challenge that everybody faced was that informal formative assessment became really hard because teachers couldn't see the body language or facial expression of their students anymore on Zoom. It was very hard to have any input of data, how the students are doing. For example, I'm talking right now to a screen and I have no idea how everybody is reacting. So similarly, the teachers felt the same way too. And there was also a lot of internal conflict among teachers to reduce their expectations because they were so used to like driving their students for excellence and everything. And some of them also struggle with the grading system as well. And here is a quote from Mike, who explained how his assessment got streamlined and more efficient. And then again, there was a contrast. Affluent school teachers were still assessing their students. They were still giving out quizzes and tests, but they were more lenient with these quizzes and tests, and they gave more individualized assessments to their students. And here is a quote from Adam for that. Whereas for high needs school teachers, the assessment process was highly relaxed. Even partial completion was enough. And since they were teaching mostly asynchronously, there was no formative assessment happening with them. And here's a quote from Hank, which I'll read. My bottom line was, if they got half of the assignment done that was presented to them, we gave them a pass. So this is like a contrast of how assessment practices look different in these schools. And now talking about teaching practices, again, in general, everybody went on Zoom. Basically, the rigor and time of teaching was reduced. Teachers tried new and fun things in this remote learning to engage students more. Some of that looked like demos and virtual labs and FED simulations. And they all were challenged in the sense that it was hard to keep students engaged. There was no group work happening among students, learning the new platform as they were trying to sail through this for the first time. And then challenge of replacing hands-on and active learning activities that they usually do in a classroom, not having the freedom to do that on Zoom. But again, there was a contrast in terms of teaching too. Affluent schools were teaching more synchronously. They were still preparing the students for AP exams and tests, but they struggled mostly with covering the same depth of the material or at the same speed. And so they had to cut down a lot on recall and reinforcement processes. And whereas high needs schools were mostly asynchronous, they were mostly reviewing the old stuff. Basically, their classwork became their homework assignments, and they struggled to use Zoom efficiently as well. And at the end, they were mostly not very satisfied with their teaching process. Even though there was a difference in these two clusters of schools, there was still some commonness among these two categories of schools, which was basically among Alisa from affluent school and then high needs school teachers. And these three codes were shared among these five teachers actually. So Alisa was more like high needs school in this sense. And the reason for this is perhaps because Alisa was the only school from the affluent category whose grading system was pass and incomplete, and not the same grading system as Adam and Amy had kept their grading system as. So that shows that grading system is a very important criteria in how your assessment practices look like, even though the student population is very different in high needs schools compared to Alisa's school. So moving on with that, some minor findings in terms of teaching were that grading system impacted how teachers taught and how they felt the challenge of teaching. And some of them also realized that the choice-based differentiation of assignments is a really good practice, which is also shown by research that it is actually a good form of differentiation. Some teachers also talked about how cross-cuts in concepts that confess basically that they don't generally teach it or assess it directly in the classroom. And some teachers also felt a very unique kind of challenge with students not being able to text or communicate through writing. And these two teachers were actually our middle school teachers in the study. So this was something more common for young students in middle school, and that they find it hard to communicate and show their learning or performance through text and writing. So moving on, so what other factors actually influenced these teachers when they were teaching and assessing apart from everything else that we saw? The two important factors were administration and parents outside of classroom. And in a nutshell, basically all affluent and middle level teachers mostly said that they felt they were supported from parents and administration. And here's an example from Adam, who talked about it, that he felt he was very grateful for his administration and their support, whereas high needs school teachers were mostly feeling challenged from parents and administration. And here's a quote from Hope again, who talked about the challenges that she was facing from parents who were not helping with the new online schooling system where their role was very enhanced. And at the end of the interview, I also wanted to leave them on a positive note, and also I wanted to see what were some successful strategies that they used to overcome these challenges that they were facing. So these set of 3 questions was asked to them. And the first question was, what was the successful strategies for you that worked? And most teachers mentioned that reducing expectations and letting go was a really important one. Collaborating was also important. Realizing what is the essential piece of their lesson plans and assessments was important for them too. And keeping the structure and format same was very helpful as well. And then some positives for teachers were being available to try new things in teaching, supporting, and the teachers who got the support from admin and parents, they felt very positive about that as well. Teachers also felt positive about learning new technology, which they usually were avoiding for most purpose. Knowing the students in advance was helpful as well, because in March, when the lockdown happened, they already knew who their students were at that time, compared to starting a fresh class on Zoom, which could have been even more hard for them. And some plans for their future looked like they want to have hopefully more synchronous teaching. They want to find more ways to do home labs and interactive activities on Zoom and online classes. And some of them are also definitely thinking about keeping Google Classroom for the future as well as they teach in regular classrooms. So this was the 5 themes and the findings that we had. How does this all connect to the literature that is out there globally about different countries and even different states in the United States? So let's just talk about that in the discussion section for a little bit. In terms of student impact, a lot of research shows that teenagers were highly impacted in terms of mental health. Their motivation and social well-being was also very much impacted during COVID times. There's also research that shows that students who come from disadvantaged area face a lot of technology issues or environmental issues. And this is true not just for America, but also for a country like India, which Dr. Singh showed in 2020. And study shows the concern for students with special needs was actually very much amplified during COVID time as well. And this is something which we also found consistent with our study for students and teachers in Maine. And the next thing we also saw was in terms of teacher expectation was there is a lot of study that shows that yes, teacher expectations does influence how much our students learn. And there's also studies that shows that actually there are teachers' expectations are very low in schools with low socioeconomic status, so where the student population is not as resourced. But there is also a study that talks about we don't know how and why this happens. And this is where this qualitative research has some value to add, that if we connect it to where students are coming from, it could help us understand why they're forming the expectations, the expectations that the teachers are forming, why they're forming those expectations. And the next thing was about teaching and assessment practices, and which was also pretty much in line with what teachers have seen globally, researchers have seen globally in countries like China and Israel. So yes, they were using new teaching methods everywhere on the globe. Students in high need districts were actually not able to do work. This was very common among other states in the United States as well. And there was struggle with differentiation of instruction and everything too. So this is again in line with what we found as well. And then there are some extra findings too from around the world, like from Dong in China, for example, showed that the role of admin and parents were very much way more important during this time compared to normal times because of students being in home all the time. And then teachers, some researchers have also found that self-efficacy among teachers improved throughout the globe with technology. So everybody felt that they got better with technology. Definitely, I also got better with technology after the pandemic. So putting all of this together in conclusion, like we talked about, this was our flow chart for different themes. Students were impacted, priorities shifted for teachers, they taught and assessed in a different way, and some other factors outside the classroom were also influencing. And then at the end, they learned a lot through this experience too. But just to restate and complete the study, students struggled with mental health, routine, structure, and environment. High-need ones struggle more than affluent ones. And this led to an exaggeration of the inequity that already exists in Maine classrooms. And the next thing was that in the wake of these struggles that students were having, teachers shifted their priorities and expectations with less rigor on teaching and assessment and more on well-being, which again was slightly different for affluent school compared to high-need schools. And this led to teachers struggling a lot, and they did the best that they could to retain engagement and attendance, but they still struggle. They struggle to teach, they struggle to assess, and they struggle to provide support to their students. And the role of parents and admin during this time for schools became way more important than ever before. Like one of our teachers, she quoted that parents were the new teachers in home in this remote learning, and teachers were like the new admins. So that I think is a very good way to put it, how the parents and teachers roles, admin roles were very important during this time. Last but not the least, teachers learned a lot, and they hope to be more prepared for the future, because when it happened in March, it was very sudden for them. So they all have plans to definitely improve it as they go on with the teaching in fall 2020. And I'd like to finish this study and the representation with one last quote from a teacher that said, we all face a lot of difficult situation, and COVID-19 was one of the most difficult situations we ever faced. And being able to have a study that basically is trying to see what we can learn from this difficult situation is a really good spin on a difficult situation. So thank you so much. And that's it from my side. And I'll hand the floor back to Michael.
Thank you, Raj, for that presentation, and well done. It's always hard to see when people are clapping unless people have a gallery view turned on. The format that we use for question and answer afterward is that the floor is now open for questions from everyone. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask, it's probably easiest to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. And the format, the way it works out is that we will now have a chance for a public question and answer session. Then after that is ended, we will be able to, we'll take a short break. Anybody who wishes to stay, odd rules from the University of Maine. If you have a PhD and you want to ask a question more in private, you can do that. Usually what happens, it's just the committee that hangs out after the short break. And so then the committee of Asla and Franzi and me will have a chance to ask Raj some more questions. So it's 9:35. We've got plenty of time for some questions. If you have one, please raise your hand on Zoom, and or I see Indira, if you will, if you could ask your question. You're first.
It's a very good presentation, Raz, but I do have one question. What is the future direction of your research?
Well, honestly, I'm going into teaching now. But in terms of implication for the research, there are a lot of findings that were very consistent with already what was out there, but there were some findings that could be potentially explored more. For example, one of the findings was that some students all of a sudden started doing better in remote learning compared to a regular classroom. So that could be further explored to see how we can support those students even in a regular classroom. And what were the factors that really helped them when they went into remote instruction. So definitely there is a lot of potential in that sense, and every finding could be like seen in some way that it can be extrapolated for future study. But I am done with research.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Julie Meyer, please. Thank you.
Unmute. Okay. Raj, wonderful. Do you think that the focus on well-being was one that was able to survive the return to the classroom?
Honestly, I think yes, it was very important for teachers to focus on the well-being. And the reason is, again, citing the triangle that we saw from Maslow, like unless your fundamental needs for physiology and psychology and emotional needs are met, it's hard for you to make any gains in your learning outcomes. So I definitely think focusing on well-being was an important step, and teachers did it the right way.
Glenn.
Thank you, Raj. I greatly appreciated your laying out the methodology the way you did. I'm wondering, maybe I missed it, but can you talk about the time aspect here a little more, and in particular, the hierarchy of needs, how that changed over time throughout your study, and what you think the implications might be for schools and teachers with, how long a crisis goes on and that kind of thing.
Thank you, Glenn. So this study was mainly done for teachers who just came out of their first semester of remote teaching. So it was all the interviews took place in July and August time in 2020. So this was their first rodeo with the whole online teaching. So this is so this was more focused towards how did it feel like for the first time. Definitely teachers have improved a lot as we have done it for 2 years almost now. And in terms of hierarchy of needs, in the beginning, especially for high needs school teachers, it was very fundamentally based on keeping contact with students and focusing on being available for them rather than teaching any new content during that time. And honestly, like there was actually a very striking difference between how these schools reacted to the lockdown too. For example, there were the two schools, like affluent schools that I mentioned, they both kept everything the same when they went to lockdown. Like they were teaching like 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. every day on Zoom straight. Whereas for the high need school teachers, when the lockdown happened, what changed for them was they relaxed those 2 weeks to let everybody observe the shock that had happened. So during that time, their teaching was actually not as much compared to the affluent schools. So this also shows the basic mentality and approach difference in these two schools and how they approached when the lockdown happened immediately as well. So definitely the need was more based towards the basic side as we were starting in the pandemic, but as we progressed towards it and became more comfortable with it, teachers started to focus more on teaching and assessment than the basic needs of students.
Thank you, that was helpful.
So there's space for more questions, but I will, I do have a chance to ask questions later on in private, but I will ask one in public just because as you were talking now, it struck me again, how interesting it is that some of Alyssa's performance, responses, behavior, I don't know what word to use, but some of what Alyssa reported was very similar to the high needs teachers, but Alyssa was at one of the affluent schools. So can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So yes, Alyssa and like the similarity in how Alyssa experienced teaching and assessment with the high needs school shows a lot about how much important it is that the decisions that we make at the policy and the decision that administrators usually make in different schools, because it wasn't just about the student population or the resources the schools had, but it was also about the policy that was implemented by the school that kind of define the trajectory for teaching and assessment for these teachers. So I think it's a really good example of the emphasis of the grading system and how that impacts the teachers in a classroom too, and how that either improves their teaching practices or limits them. And in this case, it was more limiting for Lisa than actually improving for her. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I'll ask more about that later on. As a follow-up question, I suppose. Do others have questions? Asla.
Thank you. I do have several questions for later too, but there's one that I think everybody might want to hear about. So I see that I think Susan McKay is not here, and I'm going to ask her question since you mentioned that you're going to go to teaching, right? And she typically asks the question about how do you see the implications of this study for teaching, for teachers? Because you mentioned some, important findings in terms of like lack of assessment and some frustrations around that even. There's impacted learning, impacted student well-being, and leaving the practices, out of the curriculum. Basically, you mentioned a lot of these important findings, and I'm now curious, how would this impact the teachers and teaching in general, and also maybe you can tell us a little bit about what type of school you'll be in, because you categorize them in your for your methodology here. So maybe that can also help us understand. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. I would love to answer this. So definitely, like my school in Boston is a high needs school as well. It is a Title I school in Massachusetts. 95% of the kids are kids of color, and they come from poor economic backgrounds. So yes, I'm going for high need too. And definitely this research has influenced my decision making too. After going through this interviews with different teachers. One of my biggest realization, which is going to be at least helpful for my teaching, is understanding that we are teaching human beings in the classroom and understanding that they have different level of needs that we need to meet before any kind of learning can even happen. Usually our focus is always on what is the best teaching practice, or what is the best teaching assessment practices that we can adopt in a classroom to improve teaching and learning. But we also need to understand that even before any of that can happen, there is 3 layers. The students need to be present there. They need to be physically well there. They need to be emotionally well there, and they need to feel connected to the community in the classroom before they can actually observe any kind of learning. And that actually improves the learning in a lot of ways. So this was for me, perhaps the biggest outcome that I had for how I'm going to teach when I get into the high need schools. And it also helps me to understand why like the teachers in high need schools are doing way more work than that shows up in test or national standards and everything, because they're meeting a lot of their students a lot earlier in the triangle. So they need to like provide a lot more support before any learning can happen. So even if a high need school is like doing average on test scores, I think the teachers are still doing an incredible amount of hard work there to get those students to that level.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Asla. And thanks for that answer, Raj. Do we have other questions?
The famous Zoom silence.
Yeah, but it's hard to count to 7 in your head and not want to speak up, but there you go. So if there are no other questions, let us thank Raj one more time for an excellent presentation and